Now, he never knew he was a subject in a U.S. government experiment, but he suspected something. Is that right?
Yes. He's told a good friend of his in Italy, Texas, that the doctors kept flying in and out of his room, practicing to be doctors. And he told his friend, they guinea pig me.
We interviewed Elmerine Allen a number of times, and she talked about how growing up her father would say that. And then when she was leaving for college, he said, watch out, don't let the U.S. government guinea pig you. And they always thought, well, Elmer had some kind of, he's sort of quirky, and he had this delusion that the government had experimented on him.
The sad part about and the tragic part about Elmer's story is that nobody believed him. He went to his doctor and told him, I think I've been injected with something. His doctor diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic at the same time that he was conversing with the atomic energy scientists in Argonne National Lab to provide them with tissue samples. And
Wait. His doctor said he was a paranoid schizophrenic at the same time his doctor was providing Elmer's tissues to the government scientists doing the experiment?
That's correct. That's what the medical records show.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Will to Live Initiative podcast. A new podcast where I investigate ongoing, unlawful, non-consensual experimentation on innocent men and women in the U.S. and possibly abroad. I am one of those people victimized by this atrocity. And now I am working hard to restore justice by sharing evidence and information in hopes of prompting a proper investigation. Join me in my fight and help raise awareness by tuning in and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Informed consent is an important principle of medical ethics. It is the process in which a healthcare provider or researcher educates a patient or potential subject about the risk, benefits, and alternatives of a given procedure or intervention. The patient must be competent to make a voluntary decision about whether to undergo a procedure. It originates from the patient's right to direct what happens to their body. So basically, informed consent is basically saying that the person must be made fully aware of what the procedure or experiment is and what they will be exposed to during the process. They must be given enough information, and it must be determined that they understand it in order to say yes or no. They need to know exactly what they are getting themselves into. Ethics is the cornerstone of the medical field, including research and experimentation. The Belmont Report was established in 1976 and is an ethical guide to research involving human subjects. There are three basic principles outlined in the Belmont Report. 1, respect for persons. 2, beneficence. And 3, justice. Now, these three principles make up a large part of what informed consent is all about, especially respect for persons, which is basically saying that one, individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and two, persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. Researchers are often faced with a dilemma where they have something they want to test, maybe an idea, a theory, a weapon, or product. They want to test these things, but maybe they can't find people who would be willing to participate due to the possible harm a subject would have to endure. And in order to circumvent concerns or ethical guidelines, sometimes researchers will conduct their experiments in secret. Sometimes with the subjects being unaware that they are test subjects or what they're being exposed to. Subjects have often been chosen from minority communities or disadvantaged people, and sometimes even the disabled. And these people are chosen because they may not have the resources or the support to fight back or to resist. And the experiment is often disguised as something else. And it's not usually until years later that the subject finds out what's happened, if they live that long, because sometimes the subject dies before anyone becomes aware of anything. The United States government has a history of conducting secret experiments on its own citizens, whether it be testing a new weapon or supporting and sponsoring a project from a government contractor or a university. The U.S. will completely disregard citizens' rights and the law to achieve its objective. In this episode, we will look at a few of these experiments and discuss the innocent people who suffered unimaginable damage to their physical and mental well-being due to the willful negligence of researchers for profit and for their own gain. Now, first, I'm going to give you a bit of information about the experiments we'll be reviewing today. And then I'm going to share some clips that contain interviews, which gives a lot more detailed information and a lot better information than what I'm going to offer you here. The first one is Elmer Allen. Elmer Allen was a black railroad porter, and he had fallen from a train and hurt his leg. The leg didn't heal properly, and as a result, Mr. Allen was sent to the University of California at San Francisco Hospital, where, unbeknownst to him, he was selected by doctors for radiation experimentation. He was injected with plutonium in his leg, then his leg was amputated. Doctors told him this was because he had cancer, but really it was part of a secret government research project named the Manhattan Project. Yes, the same Manhattan Project with J. Robert Oppenheimer from the most recent film. While Allen was never informed about these experiments, he had his suspicions and even told a friend, "They guinea pigged me." When he went to his family doctor and told him, "I've been injected with something," the doctor diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. And we'll discuss more of Mr. Allen's story in a later clip. The next one is Ebb Cade. Ebb Cade, also a black man, worked in construction at the site of a secret weapons production plant for the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. On March 24th, 1945, while on his way to work, the then 53-year-old was involved in a traffic accident and was taken to the Oak Ridge Hospital with fractures in his arm and leg. He was described as well-developed and well-nourished and was able to tell his doctors that he had always been in good health. On April 10th, 1945, Mr. Cade was reportedly injected with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium without his consent or knowledge. Doctors left Cade's fractures untreated for 20 days until after plutonium injections began. He became known as HP-12, Human Product 12, and was the first person to be injected with Pu-239. Cade was told he had marked tooth decay and gum inflammation, and 15 of his teeth were extracted and sampled for plutonium along with bone samples. Mr. Cade departed suddenly from the hospital on his own initiative. One morning, the nurse opened the door and he was gone. Later, it was learned that he had fled to North Carolina. Mr. Ebb Cade died of heart failure on April 13th, 1953 in Greensboro, North Carolina. Next is Mr. Vertus Hardiman, also a black man, who was a victim of a U.S. government human radiation experiment at the age of 5 that left him with a painful skull deformity that forced him to cover his head for 80 years. Now, in 1928, Vertus attended the local elementary school, Lyles Consolidated School, in Lyles Station, Indiana. The parents of 10 children at school were approached by county hospital officials. The parents were told that there was a new treatment for dermatophytosis, excuse me for fumbling that, a fungal infection commonly known as ringworm. What the parents didn't know was that the children were actually part of a human experiment on extreme radiation, probably chosen because they lived in such an isolated location, and probably because they were all black. The children were exposed to high levels, and many were left with disfiguring scalp scars and head trauma. The effects of the experiment were mostly hidden from the townspeople of Lyles Station. Many of the children wore wigs and hats to cover up the results of the experiments. Vertus Hardiman, one of the children, who was 5 years old at the time, finally broke his silence more than 70 years later to a friend, Wilbert Smith, who produced a documentary called Hole in the Head. And I have yet to see this documentary, but I would like to check that out. Now, Mr. Hardiman was physically affected the worst by the radiation. As a result, he experienced a slow dissolving of the bone matter of his skull for the rest of his life. The ensuing deformed head and gaping hole at its top were disguised by a succession of hats, toupees, and wigs. Every day of his life, he spent an hour changing bandages and dressing the wound. Despite his circumstances, Mr. Hardiman lived life on his own terms and refrained from complaining about his affliction. He died at age 85, and upon his death, Mr. Hardiman bequeathed $8 million to his church and favorite educational scholarship fund. The next experiment is similar to an experiment that most of us should be familiar with by now. The Tuskegee experiment. Now, briefly, the Tuskegee experiment was conducted for 40 years. And it was basically where black men in Tuskegee, Alabama with syphilis went untreated even when the cure was available. Well, what few people know is that around the same time, from 1946 to 1948, I believe, in Guatemala, another syphilis study was being conducted. But the difference was the Guatemalan subjects were being deliberately injected with syphilis, from prisoners to prostitutes and even children. And in a clip, it will detail the experiment and its process and the effects that it had on the people in the little town where the experiment was conducted. Finally, the last two experiments that we will be taking a look at will be the Holmesburg prison experiments and the Pruitt Igoe housing project experiments. So what I'm going to do now is play the clips for you, and they'll just go back to back, and they'll give you more information about the experiments. Some will include interviews from actual survivors of the experiments and other news clips and news stories. And I encourage you to also do your own research. Plenty of information on YouTube, and if you Google it, or other social media sites that give you information on these experiments, and there are many, many more. But I just wanted to give you an example with these because these are all experiments that were conducted on black men like myself. Secret experiments, horrific experiments that many have yet to, be atoned for. And these are things that continue to happen because there have not yet been any real consequences. In none of these experiments have any of the perpetrators been prosecuted. There's been no real legal action, criminal action taken against them. Some have had settlements from lawsuits, civil lawsuits, but a lot of the researchers and people who participated in these experiments, a lot of times they were promoted, and applauded for, the work that they did, even in spite of, the lives that they damaged. So just keep it in mind, take a look at the clips, and, I hope you learn something from that. And that will end this episode. Be sure to sign the petition at change.org/will to live. Also, join me on Twitter and Instagram with the username at Will to Live US. That's WILLTOLIVEUS. And stay tuned for the next episode of the Will to Live podcast. Thanks for listening.
Tell us about one of the 18 people.
Well, I had gone off on a journalism fellowship, and I had been filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the federal government. So I had a tiny folder on this experiment. And when I came back and looked, I pulled out my folder, and I kind of maybe he had fresh eyes. And I looked at this document again, and these documents were redacted. In other words, the names of the patients were whited out, and so were the names of the doctors. And my eye fell on this line which said, physician so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so contacted the physician of Cal 3 in Italy, Texas. And what leapt out at me were the words Italy, Texas. And by then, I knew a lot about Cal 3. I knew he was an African-American man who would have been 80 years old, who would have been, who had his left leg amputated 3 days after he was injected with plutonium. And so given those few clues, and that this person might have lived in Italy, Texas, I was determined to go there and knock on every door till I found this man.
We're talking to Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Eileen Wilson. So tell us about your discovery, how you made contact.
So I got out a map. I looked up Italy, Texas. It was south of Dallas, about 60 miles. I called directory assistance, got the number for Italy City Hall, called them up, introduced myself, described the person I was looking for, and they said, "You're looking for Elmer Allen, but he died a year ago. Would you like his wife's number?" So I said, "Of course." And I wrote the number down, and within minutes I was talking to Mrs. Allen.
And what did you say?
I was very circumspect because I didn't want to frighten her, and I didn't want to seem like a kook, and I also didn't want to put words in her mouth. I wanted to know what she remembered. So I just simply said that, I had some documents that suggested that her husband may have been involved in a government-funded study, and I would like to talk with her about it. And she asked me to talk to her daughter, Elmerine Allen Whitfield, and I called Elmerine, and Elmerine was very quiet on the phone as I reeled out my story, and then she said, "Okay, you can come on." And so I flew to Italy, Texas, and we sat down at Elmerine's kitchen table, and by the end of the interview, I knew, and they knew, that I had found the first of these 18 people.
Elmer's story?
Elmer's story.
What was Elmer's story? How did he end up in a hospital being injected with plutonium?
Elmer was a railroad porter. He and his wife were living in the Bay Area in the mid-1940s. They had left Texas, they had gone out there to start a better life. They had 2 young babies. Elmer fell from a train in Chicago and damaged his leg, and that sort of put him into the medical system. That was the beginning of his participation in this experiment. And his leg did not heal, and he kept going back to the doctor, and somehow he found himself in this clinic at UC San Francisco, University of California Hospital in San Francisco, and they selected him for this radiation experiment. And
But he didn't know that.
Oh, no, he absolutely did not know. He was told that he had an osteogenic sarcoma in his knee, and that they were going to have to amputate in order to save him. There's some question about whether he did or didn't have that cancer, and I do not know the answer to that. But 3 days before they amputated that leg, they injected him in the calf intramuscularly with plutonium.
Didn't he describe to his wife how they sort of put a target on his leg and they injected it in the middle of that?
They eventually, with the consent of Mrs. Allen, I was able to get Elmer's medical records from UC San Francisco, and in those medical records, the doctors talked about putting that target on his calf prior to the injection.
Now, he never knew he was a subject in a U.S. government experiment but he suspected something. Is that right?
Yes. He's told a good friend of his in Italy, Texas, that the doctors kept flying in and out of his room, practicing to be doctors. And he told his friend, they guinea pig me.
We interviewed Elmerine Allen a number of times, and she talked about how growing up her father would say that. And then when she was leaving for college, he said, watch out, don't let the U.S. government guinea pig you. And they always thought, well, Elmer had some kind of, he's sort of quirky, and he had this delusion that the government had experimented on him.
The sad part about and the tragic part about Elmer's story is that nobody believed him. He went to his doctor and told him, I think I've been injected with something. His doctor diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic at the same time that he was conversing with the atomic energy scientists in Argonne National Lab to provide them with tissue samples. And
Wait. His doctor said he was a paranoid schizophrenic. At the same time, his doctor was providing Elmer's tissues to the government scientists doing the experiment?
That's correct. That's what the medical records show. So Elmer was not only used in 1947 when he was injected with this radioactive isotope, but he continued to be used as a guinea pig for the rest of his life.
Being sent, for example, to where? Rochester, New York?
The experiment had two parts. In the 70s, in the 70s, a second generation of atomic scientists rediscovered this experiment, and so they wanted to dig up all the people who were dead who had been injected with plutonium, and they also wanted to bring whoever survived back into the lab for further studies. And Elmer was one of the people they brought back into the lab for further studies.
Under what pretext, since he didn't know, supposedly, that he was a U.S. government guinea pig?
They told Elmer, and this is all documented in the medical records, that they knew he had had a very serious cancer, and they wanted to know why he had lived so long.
Huh. Eileen Wilson is our guest, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. Unearthed the names of 18 people injected with plutonium by the U.S. government. When we come back, we're going to talk about who these scientists were. We'll hear more of the stories. And then also the group studies, the studies of hundreds of people who were given, a couple dozen disabled children in Massachusetts, fed radioactive isotopes in their oatmeal, pregnant women, hundreds of them, also served so-called vitamin cocktails containing radioactive iron. How this all happened without anyone knowing about it until recently. Stay with us.
From Penn State University, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out, connecting communities to a world of creativity and knowledge. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Welcome to Pennsylvania Inside Out. From 1951 until 1974, hundreds of Philadelphia prisoners were used as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and oftentimes dangerous medical experiments. The experiments left many test subjects, most of whom were African Americans, in excruciating pain and with long-term health problems. Our guests are Alan Hornblum, author of Sentenced to Science, One Black Man's Story of Imprisonment in America. He's the first person to shine a light on this dark chapter in American medical history. Also with us is Eddie Anthony, now known as Yusuf Anthony. His story is the focus of Hornblum's book, which is published by Penn State Press. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Patty.
Well, how did you first learn that Holmesburg prison inmates were being used as test subjects?
Well, I witnessed it. I was actually just out of graduate school, and I decided in the early 70s that I wanted to do some positive work for society rather than completing my graduate education. So
so I started working in the Philadelphia prisons, and it was on my initial tours through the complex of prisons in Philly that I saw scores of men wearing adhesive tape and bandages and all sorts of wraps around their heads and backs and arms, and I couldn't imagine the prison was that safe. Were these, knife fights on a cell block or a gang war in the prison yard? And the next day I asked the guard on the saw block, what's with all these guys who were strapped and wrapped in adhesive tape and bandages? He says, oh, that's nothing. That's just the perfume test for the University of Pennsylvania. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, they're doing perfume experiments. And it was so ridiculous to see these men who were, in many cases, killers and rapists and burglars and robbers, testing perfume. I couldn't imagine it. But in fact, what I had learned was that experiments had been going on, medical experiments, serious invasive procedures, for 20 years before I ever got there.
And not just cosmetics and perfumes.
Absolutely. I thought that was in the minority if there was any perfume. They were doing just anything you can imagine, from the innocuous to the truly dangerous.
Now, was this an anomaly in Holmesburg prison, or is this something that's gone on in other prisons across the country?
It was widespread in the Cold War years in America. From the end of the Second World War to the mid-70s, at least half the states had one prison that were hosting prison medical experiments. Pennsylvania, unfortunately, led the way with at least 10 prisons that were doing this. And it was quite common during those post-war years where institutionalized populations were being used as human guinea pigs by the medical community.
Your book really is an indictment of the Philadelphia prison system and the medical community. How did the two come to work together?
Well, it was obviously a marriage of convenience. There were folks in the pharmaceutical community and the medical community who wanted to do clinical trials. The University of Pennsylvania is a big research operation, so it was convenient to them and everybody if they could find cheap and available test subjects, and that's what the prison system afforded them. The inmates themselves were desperate to make money, not particularly well educated, so they naturally gravitated to a test where they could make far more money being a guinea pig than they could pushing a broom on a cell block.
Was it money that lured you to do your first test?
Yes, it was money, and the fact that I didn't have people coming up to visit me at the time to put money on the books for me so I could go to the commissary at the store. And also they was using it to get bail money if you had low bail. You could possibly get out on bail by participating in the tests, That's basically what lured me, you know what I mean?
Tell us about your first test.
They signed me to Johnson & Johnson bubble bath test. And I went over there, and if you ever seen the cover of Acres of Skin, they have a guy sitting on the table with patches on his back. Well, they put 6 patches on my back of bubble bath. But it was a solution they sprayed on my back to seal the pores on my back so that the tape would stick on, so that my back wouldn't sweat, and it was very toxic. That got into my bloodstream, and it poisoned me, and I'm still suffering from that particular test right now today. My hands and stuff broke out, my feet.
If we had a shot of your fingernails, we could see that your fingernails are rougher than normal fingernails.
They were a half-inch thick.
And these look good now. These look good now compared to the way they were when I was incarcerated and through the years. They was like my one finger was the size of 2 fingers. And my fingernails was growing like claws. And in fact, before my hands and feet broke out, my whole body was inflamed after the poison got into my system. It was benzoids and isotopes in the chemicals in the can. And I was sensitive to it.
Is it likely that he really wasn't testing bubble bath?
Probably was not, but we don't know for sure. These men were actually treated like guinea pigs. They weren't told exactly what it was. In many cases, they were deceived. I haven't found anybody who knew that they were being injected with radioactive isotopes or were told they were being involved in a test with Dow Chemical where dioxin was being placed on their faces and backs. So in many cases, just like you would not tell a guinea pig, this is what I'm going to do to you today, they did this with human beings in the prison system.
And it wasn't just the University of Pennsylvania Medical School involved in this. It was also the Army and the CIA. There was military testing going on as well.
If you were in the business of testing products or wanting to put a product on the market, you knew about Dr. Kligman, University of Pennsylvania, and Holmesburg prison. They were infamous, notorious in the field of human experimentation. So you had Dow Chemical in Michigan coming to Philadelphia. You had R.J. Reynolds in North Carolina for tobacco cancer tests coming to Philadelphia. You had the Army in Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, coming to Philadelphia because they knew that was a site where you could get anything tested on people.
So those are the contractors who are
correct.
paying. You're making a little bit of money. The prison's making a fair amount of money.
They're making more, and the doctors and the major proprietors, you know, the chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, are making the big bucks.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago Mr. Hornblum's first book, Acres of Skin, Human Experiments at Holmesburg Prison, a true story of abuse and exploitation in the name of medical science. When that book came out, you and others in the Philadelphia community, I think, were astounded to read that this was your story out there.
That's right. And we thought that we didn't have a case or a way to go, get recompense for what we went through. But after the book came out, we decided to come up with a class action lawsuit because we found it's a law called the rule of discovery. We thought we had signed away our rights when we were incarcerated, and we found out that the papers that they used was illegal. But when the book came out, it pointed, to the direction that they had misused us. So we came up with the class action lawsuit, but we never got through the courts. You know what I mean?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. One of the hallmarks of the Nuremberg medical trials from 1933 to 1945, Nazi doctors used concentration camps in much the way as the Holmesburg prisons were used, was a code of ethics. And one of the codes is informed consent.
First principle.
Explain what that is, and then I want to talk to you about what you thought you were getting.
Well, one of the very sad chapters of American medical history in the 20th century is that we tried the Nazi doctors. We harangued them. We told them what proper research medicine is like. We executed 7 of them. Then we write this excellent code of 10 principles, but we never bought into it ourselves. It was remarkable. We told other countries how to do it. Many of them bought into it, but we ourselves moved into the Gilded Age of research in the 1950s, where we were using retarded subjects, we were using the emotionally disturbed, we were using pregnant women, all sorts of people who were institutionalized were grist for the research mill, and that was very sad. With regard to that first principle, it also goes into the fact that the test subject should not be in a confined or coercive environment, which is particularly poignant to the story of Acres of Skin and Sentenced to Science. Our history of using prison inmates is a pretty bleak one, and unfortunately the government is actually thinking of returning to it again. So it's something that Yusef and I are very much opposed to.
What did you think you were getting into?
Well, they coerced you to believe that the tests were safe, and you weren't taking a chance or anything. But when you go over there, they gave you a simple piece of paper that read like, if something was to happen to you after the test, you can't hold the University of Pennsylvania responsible. So right there, you would automatically question it. I thought they were safe. They tell you this is just a formality. You just have to have your signature to make it believe that it was, everything was all right. But after they got you over there, and if you got sick, they didn't have no aftercare in place or nothing. This happened to me in 1964, and here it is, 2007. I'm still suffering from that.
I want to get back to that in just a moment. This is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU. I'm Patty Satalia. In his new book, Sentenced to Science, author Alan Hornblum tells the disturbing story of Eddie Anthony's days as a Holmesburg prison test subject. The book is a searing indictment of the criminal justice and medical communities that disdainfully used Philadelphia inmates as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and questionable experiments. Our guests are author Alan Hornblum and former test subject Eddie, now Yusef Anthony. Despite the experience of your first test, and I have to say that your inmates, your cellmates, were fortunate enough to undergo more innocuous tests, you signed up to do more because the need for money in prison is a strong one.
And prison being such a dangerous place. You had the test offered you a thing of being independent, where you didn't have to depend on friends or other inmates, and it was a corrupt environment. So if you had money on the books, this put a little safety on your stay in incarceration. So, like after the money runs out, which was a little bit of money for each test.
Give us an idea of what you might get paid.
Well, the first test I was on, in which I'm still suffering from today, I tested in 1964, I got something like $30-something. I didn't have to participate in the whole test because of the fact I broke out so bad about the first week. And they told me, well, you don't have to do the rest of the test. And we're going to pay you the whole amount. And the whole amount was $30-something for a 21-day, having patches put on my back every day with big blisters breaking out on me. And then eventually my whole body broke out as if I had German measles.
And people didn't recognize you. In fact, they steered away from you when you went to the mess hall.
When I went to the mess hall, they refused to sit down beside me, afraid it was contagious. They would get something, so they had to feed me on the blocks. You know what I mean? This is how bad it was. Then after you get out of jail, they got me controlled. Then when I got out, it broke out again in the street. I had nowhere to go to. They had no aftercare in place for, that you could go for refuge or for treatment. So I wound up going to the PGH, and when I did finally
get
there,
PGH?
Philadelphia General Hospital. And it's no longer in existence, but my hands and feet, the stuff that was in my whole body came down to my hands and feet. My hands were big as 8-ounce boxing gloves. I wear a 10.5 shoe. I couldn't get my foot in a 14 triple E when they took me in there. And they had me hospitalized for a whole month. And I had to be treated twice for this. Here lately, I haven't got no positive diagnosis of what I got wrong with me. It's something in my blood. I break out every time the weather gets warm. I break out again. They give me a little salve to bring it under control, but I never get rid of it.
In addition to the physical and emotional trauma of having gone through this, the African American community seems to be distrustful of the American medical system in general, not because just this, but also because of Tuskegee, the syphilis experiments, and other things. Talk a little bit about that.
The African American community is very reluctant to deal with doctors in the medical community. They have very low rates of participation in contributions on body parts and transplants and visiting doctors and what have you. And it's not just the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is probably the most infamous case of unethical medicine, but all of these other cases that are out there that maybe haven't digested in the American Caucasian mind. But for example, in Philadelphia, unfortunately, there are so many African Americans who have had relatives who went through Holmesburg for that quarter century. They have heard from fathers or grandfathers or brothers what happened, and the circle of friends that Eddie and all the other thousands were used in. They really become legitimately distrustful of the American medical community.
Explain, if you would, the experiments were conducted, quote, under the direction of University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Albert Kligman is someone you mentioned in your book. What exactly did under the direction of mean?
Well, it meant that it was basically his operation. He walks into Holmesburg prison back in 1951, ostensibly to help out with another outbreak of ringworm and athlete's foot. But he's a very bright, creative guy. And right away, he recognized the potential for research medicine. He sees an institution with 1,200 people, and as he thought to himself and said many times over and over, there were acres of skin in there that you could use for medical experimentation. So he meets with the superintendent of the prison subsequent to that, and he says, I think I can help you out, maybe you can help me. And over a handshake, they develop a system that runs for a quarter century where the inmates are basically farmed out to the University of Pennsylvania, and this doctor who will coordinate all of these experiments. Initially, I think they were rudimentary academic studies, but then you have the pharmaceutical companies coming, looking to do phase 1 tests on some innocuous things as well as some very dangerous things. Then you have the Army, the CIA, you have R.J. Reynolds, you have Dow. Everybody knows about Philadelphia, and these inmates become part of sort of contract labor that we had in the last part of the 19th century in the Deep South is happening in the North, with prison systems being turned over to doctors in the medical community.
Did some tests pay better, and were there red flags that this one pays better, it's probably also more dangerous?
Exactly. The tests that the Army bought in the Pentagon, they built trailers in between the blocks with padded cells in them, and they start experimenting with warfare agent chemicals. the first test on LSD was done on the inmates in there. They put them in padded cells, and you got a long list of people suffering from mental problems right now today, going back to when I was in there in 1964. They go on and being treated at Warren E. Smith's Drug and Alcohol Mental Retardation Center for paranoid, schizophrenic, and things like that. They're from the government's tests.
People who became, as you described them, like zombies.
Yeah, they were using all sorts of psychotropic drugs and very high levels of atropine, scopolamine, benzolates, belladonnoids. The Army at that time in the 60s was looking for something that would create the Manchurian Candidate, quite frankly, as well as to incapacitate the enemy. And they had initially been using these things on soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal, but it was laying these men out for an extended period of time. They needed another test site. They knew to come to Philly because we had already achieved that reputation with Kligman, Holmesburg, and University of Pennsylvania.
Now, for his part, according to your book, Kligman, who was recognized by a prestigious medical society for his achievements in his field, issued a statement saying that his research, quote, was in keeping with this nation's standard protocol for conducting scientific investigations at the time.
That's a pretty sad commentary, but there may be some truth to it because, as I said, anybody who was in a vulnerable position in an institution could be used as a test subject. There was not the concern back in those days. There was everybody, trusted the medical community and doctors, and they were able to, take advantage of the situation. And it's not one of the facts that we should be particularly proud of. I think Holmesburg is actually worse than just about any other I can think of because they're doing cancer studies at Ohio State Penitentiary. They're doing testicular transplants in Oregon and Washington State, but they tend to be only for a few years and target one area. Holmesburg was actually a department store of opportunity for researchers. Anything you wanted done, you could come there. For example, the Army and the CIA are doing these psychotropic drug studies. Kligman has no specialty in that. He's a skin doctor, but he's willing to take their money and do the test, and they're willing to use him to get their data. So it was a marriage of convenience, and the test subjects were grist for the mill.
Right.
What recourse, if any, you mentioned a class action suit.
Right. Well, we got some lawyers interested in what we were doing, and they took our case pro bono. But it seemed like as soon as we get to a certain area in the courts, that the lawyers would look like they would sell us out. And I think it was because
the lawyering wasn't the best. I mean, some of these guys, can make the argument first they were screwed by the doctors and then they were screwed by the lawyers. But it's also a problem in Pennsylvania. You have a 2-year window with a statute of limitations from when you knew or should have known you were damaged to file suit. These guys, quite frankly, didn't know until Acres of Skin comes out in '98 exactly what they were being exposed to. And when they first started coming to the meetings in that summer and they're reading the book, they recognized the experiments but had no idea that they were testing these things because they had never been told the truth.
You mentioned earlier that there's this human experimentation in prison is currently a pretty hot topic of debate, and in fact there's a number of influential medical experts who are petitioning the federal government to loosen the regulations that were established back in the 70s. In addition to that, there's legislation introduced in Missouri and South Carolina that has offered prisoners reduced sentences if they donate an organ.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you
well,
make of that.
it's the latter part that you bring up is a very utilitarian deal that's being made. They see some folks who need body parts. It could be a kidney, it could be a lung, it could be bone marrow, and then we have over 2 million people in prison doing time. Why not use those imprisoned people as a farm body, a factory of body parts? So in Missouri, I think they were going to offer a reduced sentence if you were sentenced to death. Now you would get life in prison if you gave up a body part. In South Carolina, I think the legislation they introduced, you would get a half year off your sentence if you gave up a body part. So these are people in the legislative arena who see a need and see all these people, throwaway people, for the most part, but it's a very slippery slope to move into that arena.
I want to end with this because I think few doctors would dispute that testing drugs on people is necessary. No amount of using lab animals will tell us reliably how certain things will work. That said, is there a way in your mind to use the prison population in medical experimentation in an ethical way? I want to start with you and then end with you.
I believe on paper, theoretically, you can say that and argue that, but in actuality, those prison walls not only keep the inmates in, they keep the public out. It is so easy to take advantage of that situation that I oppose it.
Okay, and I'm sorry I don't have time to follow up on that. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Okay.
Our guests have been Alan Hornblum and former test subject Eddie, now Yusuf Anthony. The book is Sentenced to Science. For Pennsylvania Inside Out, I'm Patty Satalia.
This next story is so unbelievable, we didn't think it could possibly be true. But after receiving thousands of records and declassified reports from the Army, it's confirmed that during the Cold War, the United States military conducted secret tests on unsuspecting people in the city of St. Louis. A local sociologist will make her findings public tomorrow, but she spoke first to the I-Team's Lisa Zigman.
Lisa Martino-Taylor's life work has been to uncover details of the Army's ultra-secret military experiments carried out in St. Louis and other cities during the 1950s and 60s.
This study was secretive for a reason. They didn't have volunteers stepping up and saying, yeah, I'll breathe zinc cadmium sulfide with radioactive particles.
These Army archive pictures show how the tests were done in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1960s. In Texas, planes were used to drop the chemical, but in St. Louis, the Army placed chemical sprayers on buildings and station wagons. City officials were kept in the dark about the tests. The Cold War cover story was that the Army was testing smoke screens to protect cities from a Russian attack. The truth, according to Martino-Taylor, was much more sinister.
It's pretty shocking. The level of duplicity and secrecy, clearly they went to great lengths to deceive people.
By making hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, she uncovered once classified documents that confirmed the spraying of zinc cadmium sulfide. The greatest concentration of this compound was sprayed near the Pruitt Igoe housing complex just south of downtown St. Louis. It was home to 10,000 low-income people, and an estimated 70% were under the age of 12. Martino-Taylor claims they all unknowingly inhaled this compound morning, noon, and night, so the government could measure its effects on their lungs.
So this is in violation of all medical ethics, all international codes, and the military's own policy at that time.
In 1994, then Congressman Richard Gephardt asked the Army to open its records and explain the St. Louis testing.
We want to make very sure that nothing went on that would harm anyone and that all the facts are out on the table.
Documents released in the 90s show the Army placed sprayers on this former Knights of Columbus building on Lindell and in Forest Park. The Army always insisted the chemical compound was safe. Martino-Taylor believes documents prove otherwise.
There's a lot of evidence that indicates that people in St. Louis, in the city, particularly in minority communities, were subjected to military tests that was connected to a larger radiological weapons development and testing project.
For the first time, she links the St. Louis testing to a company called U.S. Radium, a company notorious for lawsuits involving radioactive contamination of its workers.
The United States Radium had this reputation where they had been found legally liable decades prior for producing a radioactive powdered paint that killed many young women who painted fluorescent watch dials.
While the Army admits it added a fluorescent substance to the zinc-cadmium compound, details of whether it was radioactive remain secret. Documents uncovered to date indicate the Army never conducted follow-up studies to see whether the compound caused long-term health issues. In 1972, after years of crime, poverty, and decline, the government destroyed the Pruitt Igoe housing complex. Lisa Zigman, News Channel 5, I-Team.
Now, the company U.S. Radium no longer exists. Martino-Taylor has placed all of her research, including the declassified documents, online, and will link you to that data at ksdk.com. Now, she will make all of her findings public tomorrow at St. Louis Community College Merrimack campus. In the meantime, if you remember the spraying, The I-Team's Lisa Zigman would like to hear from you. You can email her at lzigman@ksdk.com.
In 2003, Susan M. Reverby, a professor at Wellesley College, unearthed a long-forgotten unethical medical experiment conducted over half a century ago among dusty files in Pennsylvania Archive. Starting in 1946 and until mid-1950s, the U.S. government conducted medical experiments in which over 5,000 uninformed and unconsenting Guatemalan people were intentionally infected with bacteria that cause sexually transmitted diseases. The study involved vulnerable populations in Guatemala, including children, orphans, child and adult prostitutes.
And the goal of the research was to determine whether taking penicillin after sex would protect against those sexually transmitted diseases. It was a medical priority at the time, especially in the military.
Y me acostaron en una camilla. Entonces un doctor estaba de este lado y el otro, y la enfermera me tenía agarrada la cabeza. Entonces ellos hicieron por abrirme las piernas, ¿verdad? Y yo no quería. Entonces yo como niña de 10 años con sus fuerzas que podía tener, ¿verdad? Yo no quería y no quería, yo hacía lo posible porque no. Entonces ellos decían no se puede, no se puede.
After this reprehensible medical experiment was revealed, the victims brought a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government under the Alien Tort Statute, 28 U.S.C. Section 1350.
The Alien Tort Statute, what we refer to as the ATS, is a very old statute. It dates back to 1789, and what it does is it allows non-U.S. citizens to sue in U.S. courts for violations of international law.
Terry Collingsworth is a Washington-based human rights lawyer representing the Guatemalans who've emerged to file a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government.
The fact that they went to Guatemala is partly, at least, due to the fact that everyone understood that Guatemala was a place where there were no rights for poor people or people in prison, and that you could pretty much do what you wanted with them. So to take advantage of that kind of situation certainly multiplies the crime.
However, the case was never heard on its merits and was dismissed for failing to state a legal claim on June 12, 2012. After the lawsuit against the U.S. government got dismissed, the victims sought a different recourse. They filed a new lawsuit accusing Johns Hopkins University and the Rockefeller Foundation for conducting the study in Guatemala from 1945 to 1956, and Bristol Myers Squibb Pharmaceutical Group for supplying drugs for the experiments. It was initially dismissed last year, but U.S. District Judge Marvin J. Garbus has allowed to move forward in August 2017.
Well, I think they've gotten over sort of the major initial obstacle to be allowed to go forward, which is great. I think that in the future, among the obstacles, there are many, is that this happened a long time ago, and so you have getting the evidence together to prove the case, I think, is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to get that information from Johns Hopkins and Rockefeller. It's going to be difficult to get it from the victims.
How does this case reflect upon our tort system? First, we have to understand how this horrific experiment could have happened in the first place. The treatment of syphilis and other venereal disease became of great interest to the United States during the early to mid-20th century.
But I imagine, for example, that the scientists, that the government officials involved felt like their interest in seeing whether or not penicillin would be kind of powerful in a certain way overrode the interests of the people who they were experimenting on. And in order for that to happen, you obviously have to have a very particular view about the value of these people's lives, the value of these people's health, sort of who they are and what the cost to them is versus the great outcome that you think you might get by running these experiments.
In tortious cases like this, in-group and out-group dynamics can play an incredibly important role. Here, the American scientists likely view the Guatemalan subjects as the out-group. Thus, the harmful effects inflicted upon the Guatemalans fell outside of the doctor's scope of justice. The doctors likely viewed the benefits to their in-group by achieving medical breakthroughs as substantially outweighing any negative costs to the Guatemalans. In fact, this wasn't the only syphilis study on an out-group that we saw in this era. The Tuskegee experiment had already begun when the Guatemalan syphilis experiment took place. However, the Tuskegee victims received a $10 million settlement. It is important to note that Tuskegee victims had more political backing and legal options. The Guatemalans are in a different situation.
And they don't really have important political backers. I think that's really the main difference. I think they suffered the same kind of abuse.
One may wonder why it took so long for claims to be brought regarding this experiment. One explanation may be the obstacles that the plaintiffs faced in going through the steps of naming, blaming, and claiming. For one victim of this experiment, Federico Ramos, he explains that because he did not know he was subject to experimentation, he was unaware of what caused his health problems and failed to receive a proper diagnosis. Like Ramos, many of the infected were uninformed. Years later, Ramos was able to discover that he was suffering from gonorrhea. Finally, he had a name for his ailment. It is clear that the individuals who were medically experimented on, especially those who did not provide consent, could be considered situationists or balls. However, the dispositionist actors, the sticks, in this scenario, the United States and other researchers have so far been able to evade liability. The United States and the individuals working directly for the government have been considered immune from prosecution due to sovereign immunity in relation to the alien tort claims brought against it. The tort system has been thought of as a mechanism that can provide some form of relief for those who have been wrongfully injured. At this point, the tort system has not been able to provide relief to the victims of the Guatemalan experiment, but there is hope for the victims as the current lawsuit moves forward. However, the outcome of this case may prove to be important not just for the victims, but for the tort system as a whole.
There was another case involving the Pfizer company in West Africa where people were given drugs without their informed consent. So I think, unfortunately, some American companies or research institutes thought that they could take advantage of people in other countries without giving them that kind of informed consent. And maybe in this case it's a product of the 1950s, one would hope. But the Pfizer case indicates that even as recently as the last decade or so, drug companies believed that they had the right to do what amounts to medical experimentation on people without their informed consent. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's still going on in some places, which is one of the other reasons why the case is so important, so that it could stand as a deterrent to that kind of behavior in the future, which I think is also one of the purposes of the tort system, right? To impose costs on tortfeasors that will lead them not to engage in that kind of behavior in the future.